Welcome to ODI Bites, a series of events that will address critical global challenges. We will talk about the likely impacts of Covid-19 on achieving the SDGs, the scope for synergies, and the risks of difficult trade-offs between the response to the pandemic and global commitments.
Amina, governments all over the world have had to take rapid and dramatic policy decisions in many areas to combat the virus. Do you see synergies between those decisions and what we all have to do to implement the SDGs?
First, it's important that governments consider sustainability more seriously. So we have seen harsh measures taken over the last few months, which resulted in a reduction in global carbon emissions. And for this year, the expected drop is 5%. And it's the second largest fall since the global financial crisis. This is an important gain in the sense that we now can envision, rather than in a hypothetical scenario, what breathing cleaner air could feel like. And if that were to galvanize action towards more sustainable choices around how we consume and produce goods and services, how we plan our cities, so around urban mobility and transport issues, this is going to have effects on all kinds of SDGs, and especially SDGs 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12, and 13. The second synergy area that I see are the ability of governments to ensure progressive realization of universal goals. So if you think about increasing efforts to raise access to education and health for all through health and education systems strengthening, then there's clearly synergies for crisis response and goals 3, 4. And when it comes to other areas also around universality, so access to water and sanitation for all and to energy, will have equally important effects in the achievement of SDGs 6 and 7. So I think countries need to take universality very seriously in ensuring that benefits accrue to all and not to some. And that will also signal significant, clear commitment to leaving no one behind. I think a third key area, which is very important, is to exploit cross-sectoral synergies. So looking through some of the areas where crisis response needs to happen, maximizing the number of investments being made across sectors so that governments do development policy-related work with those synergies in mind. And that will help also break some of the siloed policy-making practices that we've become accustomed to.
How do you think governments can spot synergies and synergies between their COVID responses and SDG implementation? And are there practical steps which can be taken within each government to identify potential synergies?
One of the things practically that they can do is map policy choices from the lenses of synergies and trade-offs to help further roll out COVID response and recovery plans, and with progress on SDG implementation. And equally importantly, help catch poor choices early in the SDG implementation period, rather than lock a country into an unsustainable development path. So policymakers can start by situating choices on a spectrum to identify all possible synergies based on existing and emerging evidence, and then highlight where these synergies are clearly outweighing the likely trade-offs, and finding ways to maximize the synergies and mitigate the trade-offs. So in Ethiopia, for example, the Productive Safety Net Program, PSNP, had over the years already made demonstrable progress on SDG targets relating to poverty, health, income, and climate. So that's SDGs 1, 3, 8, and 13. When the crisis struck and when cases were being reported in Ethiopia, the Prime Minister did initiate a multi-sectoral preparedness and response plan. And in it, he had planned to dedicate over 600 million to rural and urban PSNP, targeting emergency food distribution to 15 million individuals that are vulnerable to food insecurity and were not currently covered by the programs. So that's effectively extending the program across the territory, which hadn't been the case earlier on. and the clearest synergies are with the goals on poverty, hunger, and health. And they equally demonstrate a greater commitment to leave no one behind. So my first question is about trade-offs. So won't there be a lot of difficult and risky trade-off decisions for governments, David?
There will be. I mean, there is no doubt that governments are taking many decisions now on lockdowns, border closures, social distancing, which have profound impacts on their societies and go in the wrong direction in terms of SDG implementation. This will present many unpleasant trade-offs, such as, for example, a huge emphasis on healthcare systems as opposed to other economic and social priorities. And this is worrying in terms of making progress on the SDGs. I see this as a problem continuing as countries go into recovery mode. There'll be tension, for example, between getting economies restarted and providing ongoing social protection, indeed improving social protection. So there are many examples of difficult trade-offs which governments will face.
Thank you. That's a great comprehensive overview of some of the major trade-offs that are likely to occur. And so I would delve into the second question that I have in mind is, how can governments use guiding principles as they struggle with these difficult decisions relating to trade-offs?
Well, I think, Amina, that the principles are already there in the SDGs and the 2030 agenda. In many ways, as governments try to navigate their way through the crisis and beyond it, the SDGs are their best guide. They are a kind of blueprint for the sort of world which we want to have and which is now all the more urgent because of this crisis. The crisis has shown the degree of global interconnectedness, interdependence. The pandemic clearly can be conquered only with international cooperation. We've seen many examples of this. Working on a vaccine is one of them. The provision of PPE is another. The SDGs themselves are the only uncontested agenda for global action in the sense that while other agreements like the Paris Agreement have suffered some loss of support in recent years, only the SDGs remain accepted by all 193 member states of the UN, and that is an asset we should work with many countries having to rebuild their economic and social systems in the wake of the pandemic, or indeed in anticipation of further waves. We actually have an opportunity now to build fair, resilient, and inclusive societies. Of course, this will be very challenging, and the resources which we hoped to have a couple of years ago for the SDGs will take a hit in the next few years. There is no doubt. But I think that I would emphasize more the opportunity which exists to, as it were, leap forward. Many countries, in fact, will have to reconstruct themselves, or at least strengthen their defenses against this crisis and possible continuation of it. Now is the time to use the principles and indeed the commitments set out in the SDGs to actually create that society. So far from the SDGs being less relevant in the wake of the crisis, I think that they have become more relevant.
Thanks again for a comprehensive answer. I think similar to how you had posed a question to me on practical recommendations, I would be keen to hear about how you think that some of these issues around the harmful effects of particular decisions that governments are feeling they may be forced to take, and what kind of possible mitigating mechanisms you think that could work?
It is very tricky. I mean, there is no doubt that governments will wrestle with these decisions, and in many cases will probably go in directions that we might not like to see them go. In other words, these are complex, competing policy requirements, and they will not always be resolved by governments in the best interests of the sustainability agenda. I'd like to think they would, but we have to be politically realistic. If difficult trade-offs have to be accepted, then in my view, they should at least be proportionate in terms of the damage likely to be done to the most vulnerable groups in society, and also to the wider objectives of the SDGs. Governments therefore have to be able to recognise and analyse trade-offs which are likely, or which may become necessary, and they should, I think, build in measures to keep them as far as possible time limited, and indeed ring fence, in a sense, clearly labelled as exceptional measures which will have to be kept under constant review. In other words, what we don't want to see is governments drifting almost in a lazy way into decisions based on short-term expediency, which don't actually recognise or recall the commitments that they all made merely 5 years ago to bring about a transformed world.
Amina and David, ahead of today's Bite session, we have reached out to our ODI audience who have sent us their top questions they are interested in finding out more about.
Yes, when the SDGs were being designed across member states and at individual level, people did think that these were very ambitious, unattainable sets of goals and indicators, 17 goals, over 100 targets, and over 200 indicators. So measuring and monitoring progress, they felt, was anyway going to be a very difficult challenge. However, at the time, it was the only way to bring forth and consider that we as a global community are set on a path which is simply unsustainable. And that was the reality which we were anyway faced with, COVID crisis or no crisis. So people need to reconsider how they engage with the SDGs agenda. It's important that we deliver on the commitments to leave no one behind. And whilst in the last 5 years, there's been considerable investment in making sure that that emphasis is laid out globally, you will see through several public health key development messages, globally, ministers, government leaders have all said that they will deliver on leaving no one behind. That includes children and youth, that includes vulnerable workers, slum dwellers, refugees, the internally displaced, persons with disabilities, women, indigenous persons. So we already were thinking about a future for each and single one of these criteria and groups that have faced social identity and geographic related discriminations. And going forward, it's important to realize that these are the groups that have been the worst off and most affected by the crises. And so, again, thinking about sustainability is what should be on our mind as government leaders and as informed citizens as we embark on the recovery and response plans for the rest of the year in 2020 and over the coming years.
Thank you for such a rich discussion today. Please share with us your final thoughts.
Number one, governments should be aware of the difficult trade-offs which will arise in terms of implementation of the SDGs because of what they've had to do during the COVID response, and they must try to manage these trade-offs as fairly and as efficiently as possible. Number two, the SDGs are the blueprint for the way forward. Governments made a particular commitment to leaving no one behind as part of the SDGs. That is now more important than ever in the wake of COVID-19. Most of all, I feel that inequality is going to be a serious consequence of the crisis, and the SDGs exist in order to overcome inequality and poverty and injustice.
Thank you, David. So I have three key messages for policymakers as they consider further decisions on SDG implementation as well as crisis response and recovery. First, Be more deliberate in national and subnational policy efforts to achieve the SDGs and leave no one behind. Second, use the synergies and trade-off lens systematically in decision-making and in prioritization with the explicit aim of maximizing synergies between COVID responses and the SDGs where they're likely to occur. Third, expect greater public scrutiny of policy decisions and actions on response and recovery, and build in accountability on SDG progress into your plans. 2 key messages for individuals and communities as we plan our future. Let's focus on what the crisis is really teaching us about how we make certain decisions. Let's consume more responsibly and reasonably, as current patterns of consumption and production are simply unsustainable. And let's re-engage with public spaces with a greater social commitment as we return to places of work and learning.
Thanks for tuning in to ODI Bites. Find out more about our latest research at odi.org.